Hello and welcome to Edison TV. Today I'm joined by Dr. Rob Trezona, who's a founding partner of Kiko Ventures, IP Group's dedicated clean tech investment platform. And today we're talking about nuclear fusion, which is a topic that's been very much front and center of the news recently with the announcement from the National Ignition Facility in the US that they've achieved gain, i.e. they have succeeded in getting the process to generate more energy than they put in. Rob also sits on the board of First Light Fusion, an investee company of Kiko, who have an alternative mechanism of creating nuclear fusion. Rob, many thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Can you firstly start by explaining what nuclear fusion is, and in particular, the particular significance of the announcement that's come out of the NIF over the last couple of weeks?
So a good way of understanding both what fusion is and why it's important is fusion is the power source that powers our sun and all the stars in the universe. So if we look across the entire sort of universe of physics, it's an incredibly important process and it generates a lot of the energy that we then see as renewables, fossil fuels. So it's a fundamental source of energy in physics, and very important to us for obvious reasons. The challenge with nuclear fusion compared to nuclear fission is it has been very difficult to achieve on Earth. So when people talk about nuclear power, what they're talking about is taking big, heavy elements like uranium and splitting them, so fission, breaking them in half, and that releases energy. And fusion is pushing elements together, and there are a number of different fusion reactions, but the one people tend to focus on is combining hydrogen and making helium. That's how the sun works, and that's what this result was also about, is fusing hydrogen together to make helium and releasing a huge amount of energy at the same time.
Thank you, very interesting. And as I understand, there are two different approaches to achieving fusion, magnetic and inertial. Both the NIF and First Light Fusion work on the latter of those. Can you explain the differences between these two approaches and also discuss how First Light Fusion's approach differs from the NIF?
So the sun uses just gravity, huge quantities of gravity, and what the sun does with gravity is get all those hydrogen, and they're not even atoms, they're ions, so stripped of their electrons together at a high temperature for a decent amount of time, and then with those conditions they fuse and they release the energy. So we just don't have access to that much gravity on Earth, so we need other ways of getting the fuel, the hydrogen, confined. So the word confinement is important. And you need two other things. So you need to confine for a certain amount of time. You've got to be at a certain temperature, and you've got to have enough density. So we're trying to squash this stuff together. And at the point you're talking about fusing hydrogen, it's typically quite hot, so it's not a gas anymore. It's something called plasma. So it's got its electrons stripped off, and it's positively charged nuclei. And they just basically don't want to be compressed together. So you're trying to overcome that electrostatic sort of repulsion. And once they're close enough, they then suddenly fuse and you get the energy release. So a well-known way of doing that is with magnets. And you see that in what are called tokamak reactors. The other branch is the one we're talking about today, which is called inertial confinement. And that's where you implode the fuel, so it is sort of pushed together for a brief amount of time, so less time, at similar temperatures but higher densities. And if you get that right, you get a fusion reaction to happen. So we're contrasting sort of hitting it with a hammer, if you like. It's a simple way of describing ICF versus compressing it with a magnetic field.
Great, thank you. And then looking at the NIS progress, can you discuss the relevance of that to First Light Fusion? I mean, are they a competitor of yours, or is this work that First Light Fusion can build upon?
So this is the first time we as humankind have achieved what's called gain. So a way of looking at the system. I've got all this hot hydrogen plasma, and I put some energy into it to get it all confined and dense and hot enough. And ideally, I want more energy out from the fusion reaction that I had to put in. And to date, nobody had developed a system where that was a positive balance. So you were always needing to sort of keep supplying the reactor with more energy in than you were getting out. The UK actually used to hold the record, the Joint European Torus or JET at Culham, and now the National Ignition Facility has smashed that and got to a gain of more than 1. And in their case, what they're doing is they're using the input energy is laser light. So there's a certain amount of energy delivered to the fuel, and then the fusion reaction happens and you get energy out, and that energy out was significantly more, so 1.5 times the energy that was needed from the laser. So it's a massive scientific milestone. The National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore, where this was carried out, was never intended to be anything about practical power delivery. It's really about science and making progress in the scientific understanding. And ultimately, you need to have a power plant and a system that produces more energy than it consumes, and we're some way from that. So in the case of the National Ignition Facility, the energy stored in the capacitors that were used to charge the laser or fire the laser was many times more than the actual energy in the laser light. So NIF as a system still needed a lot more energy than it was getting out. But you were never going to get to an overall sort of power plant that made energy without going through this result. And the other piece that's significant is there's a huge amount of scientific understanding that comes out of how this was done, the particular sort of development and technology that the scientists at NIF went through to get to this result. And our company, First Light Fusion, does talk to Lawrence Livermore. They actually use their data as inputs to their model. So this is, we would characterize as a hugely significant scientific milestone. It takes away some of the discussion, which was, we're never going to get to gain. It seems too difficult. We now know we can achieve gain, and we now have still quite a difficult problem is to create systems that will ultimately go to practical power. So it's not done yet. We're not going to get one tomorrow, but we've crossed one of the critical milestones in the history of fusion energy.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And obviously there are a number of hurdles, quite a few hurdles to get through before this becomes, before fusion becomes a reality. Can you discuss what the key things that need to happen for the technology overall before we can start thinking about this as a commercial reality?
I think the probably sort of the single biggest thing now is we need people, probably in the private sector, but there are also some public sector activities, to go from showing the science to really demonstrating reactor relevant designs. So in the case of inertial confinement fusion, so where you have an amount of fuel and you deliver energy to it and you get energy out, you need to show that you can have that event happen quite frequently. So it needs to be many times an hour. It can't be once every 2 weeks is one parameter. You need to kind of show that the machine you're going to use is affordable in the context of the amount of energy you're going to generate. You need to show that you can maintain it and that you have a supply of fuel. Whilst it's a hydrogen fuel, they use heavy hydrogen, so it's not that needs to be sourced in a sustainable manner. So it's a translation from a sort of scientific activity to one that's very practically focused on power generation, and we're some way from anyone building one of those machines that can make overall net energy at the system boundary. So that the step in between is show me a reactor concept that if I build it with some level of detail can deliver net energy generation.
Thank you. And then the same question for First Light Fusion. What are the key next milestones for First Light Fusion on your development path? What should investors look for as you progress towards becoming a viable commercial business?
Yeah, so what First Light's a derivative, if you like, of NIF and has been informed by the science the decision of the founders of First Light was not to pursue the laser approach that NIF has used. And a reason for that, it's not the only reason, is the inefficiency. So less than half of the energy stored in the capacitor, 0.5%, sorry, of the energy stored in the capacitors was delivered as laser light. So there's a huge efficiency penalty from lasers. And there's actually a secondary structure. So the laser beams don't directly impinge on the target. They hit something else that re-radiates the energy. So it's a beautiful thing, but it's got low efficiency. So what the whole idea behind First Light is to try and overcome that efficiency challenge and complexity challenge by delivering the energy into the system with a very simple concept of a projectile. So First Light does something called one-sided drive, where you have a dumb bit of matter moving at high speed. That then hits what's called a target, which contains the fuel, and all the technology is inside how that target shapes a shockwave, a hypersonic shockwave from the projectile, and creates similar sort of conditions to the likes of NIF. It's having a one-sided impact like that does create some efficiency losses compared to compressing a sphere symmetrically, but they look, from our perspective, from the First Light perspective, are much less than the inefficiency losses of a laser, and the thing delivering it can be very cheap. So First Light, it's all about, let's take the science from the likes of NIF and find the simplest machine possible to do it. And so they achieved a fusion demonstration this year with a piece of equipment only costing a couple of £1 million. So it was much lower cost. And the big milestones for First Light are, first of all, to actually raise the capital to now build their own reactor relevant gain demonstrator. So the difference between First Light's plans and what NIF is doing is all about this. You would take this design and then take it to a power plant. So the first thing is really raise the capital, show in detail how that system will work and perform as a power plant, and then ultimately to build a grid connected pilot plant that has got, is achieving gain and having reactions on a regular basis that can show the overall system can be cost effective. With first of a kind, any large power plant like this, you're not expecting that first plant to be cost competitive, but they will come down a learning curve relatively rapidly. So ultimately, by the sort of end of the next decade, the end of the 2030s, we're talking about delivering power at $45 per megawatt hour. So really quite competitive, but compared to today's power prices. And on the way, you've got a pilot plant at a higher cost than that. And before that, you've got a reactor relevant gain demonstrator, which has got the imaginative name Machine 4. This is Machine 3 behind me. They go for quite literal names. So Machine 4 and the design of Machine 4 are the near-term milestones alongside that fundraise, which the company's right now going out to. And you'll have seen that this area, because of concerns about climate change and net zero, is attracting a lot of funding. So we've seen some big funding rounds, and there are other companies out raising. So that I think in the short to medium term, the actual fundraise itself is going to be a big milestone for the company.
Rob, fascinating stuff. Many thanks for joining me today.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. Great to talk to you.